Welcome back, AP Psychology. We're looking at part 2 of Module 41. We just got done talking about the 3 theories of emotion. So a continuation of this, we have what's called the spillover effect. And what happens here is you have a heightened level of arousal. Maybe you're going out for a run or whatever, but your heart is pounding. And then maybe someone jumps out in front of you and does something to scare you or to anger you. What we found is that when that arousal is already high, it's easier to switch emotions quickly. So they call this the spillover effect. So think of it like the arousal's high and then boom, it spills over, and then you go from one emotion to the next. So it's very easy to go from being excited to aggressive. And you think about, like, if you watch a lot of sports, especially like football, there's kind of a high level of people getting into fights during games. So a lot of that you can attribute to the heightened level of arousal. They're running around, and then someone does something to upset them. Maybe they push them or they block them a little bit hard, or maybe it's a cheap shot, and then boom, you've got fights breaking out. But the bottom line is that the emotion can change quickly because the context of the situation changed. And I think if you look at the theories of emotion from last video, this would best go with the Schachter two-factor. So the context changes, and because the context changed, your cognitive label, the way you think about the situation, also changes, and then you change your emotion. I just said change a lot there. The next question is this idea of, do you need to have conscious thought to have an emotion? And it's kind of a tricky one. I think it depends on the situation. And you think about times where maybe you're walking through the woods, or you're walking somewhere, and then maybe you step on something and you have like an emotional reflex and you jump. And so maybe you're afraid before you even appraise the situation. So I'm going to show you this little diagram here. Actually, I like this one better. So the theory is that there's like two different avenues or roads that an emotion can take. So with one, you look at something. Let's say you're like looking at a snake or something, and you look at it. It goes to, and don't worry about like memorizing all these brain parts, but it goes to a location known as the thalamus, which is like a sensory input center that directs the information to other parts of the brain. And then it would go to the part of the brain that processes vision, the sensory cortex, or one of those. And then it would go to the front of the brain, which is your prefrontal cortex. If you remember this from earlier this year, this is like the decision maker. So you see it, it gets processed, the senses, and it gets sent and processed. Your visual cortex processes it. Then you appraise the situation. Is this good? Is this bad? What do I think? And then it goes to that amygdala. If you remember that, that's kind of the fear and anger center of the brain. And then from there, you would get a message down to your nervous system, like, hey, you run away, or hey, your heart needs to start pounding. So this would be more of like the high thinking road. This would be where you have more complex thought about a situation. So maybe looking at a snake wouldn't be the best example, but maybe you think about, oh, I have to do something that's really anxiety provoking, like I've got a big test, or I'm going to ask someone out on a date, or whatever. The low road says that you might look at something. This would be like if you looked at a snake or some kind of scary animal or whatever, and it goes to that thalamus. And then instead of going to the thinking regions of the brain up here, it just goes straight to the amygdala and says, hey, get the heck out of here. So there's basically both of these are true. So think of it, this question of, do you need to think before you have an emotion? You could probably have like emotional type reflex, like a knee-jerk reaction. Like if you see a snake or something, you might jump away. That would use the low road. And then the high road would be when you have, for most emotions, if you're, scared or angry, it involves interpreting the situation. Again, kind of going back to Schachter. And this is part of the reason why it's my favorite theory of emotion. It seems to make the most sense. And I think most of the time our emotions are created by the way that we think to a large extent. Yeah, there's nothing new there really. This is just kind of a chart that kind of summarizes some of the different ideas in this section. We talked about these three. These guys are just talking about the idea of, do you need to think before you have an emotion. I'm not worried about you memorizing their names. Just think about the idea of two dimensions of emotion, so positive or negative. So some emotions are good, some are bad. And then you have low arousal emotions and high arousal emotions. So pretty self-explanatory there. A little bit more on physiology. This question of, do different emotions have different physiological consequences? And this would kind of get at the question of James Lange. Is that theory valid at all? What we think we know, we being people who are much smarter than me and study this for a living, is that a lot of these have very similar physiological responses when it comes to heart rate, breathing, perspiration, which would go against James Lange. They do activate different areas of the brain's cortex. So again, don't worry about the specific parts, but understand there's different brain circuits that are involved in different emotions. This would give a little more evidence to James Lange. So it's still kind of a mixed bag. Basically, there's some evidence still that there could be times where you are afraid because your heart pounds. And maybe more than one of these are right. So maybe there's an element of Schachter that's correct, but maybe sometimes when you look at yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, my palms are sweating, maybe that makes you more anxious, for example. This is just an overview, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic. So again, when we're talking about arousal, what's happening to the body? You're not going to need to memorize all of this, but just think about the basics. What happens when you get excited or nervous or angry? The sympathetic nervous system is arousing, so your pupils are going to dilate, your heart rate's going to accelerate. Those would really be the big ones. I'm not going to ask you about your liver and your kidneys. And then the parasympathetic is more calming. Your pupils are going to contract, heartbeat's going to slow, breathing's going to slow. So just kind of know the basic ones there. This is the same thing. It's the same thing. And then there's a discussion in the book on polygraph machines. I'm going to let you read this, and then if you want to bring questions to class, we can talk about it. The basic answer is basically polygraphs are mostly bogus. There's not a lot of research to back using them, even though they are still used in some government agencies. But I'm going to let you read page 428 and 429 and let you get the information there. But it's pretty interesting about what polygraphs actually do and why there's some issues with them. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.